Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Roland Zenology Pro tutorial series. Today we're going to be having a look at the Amplitude envelope, which is this thing down here. If you're enjoying this series and you'd like to see me make more videos on the Roland suite of products, please check out the Patreon link in the description below. Alternatively, you can click join to become a YouTube channel member. And we've got a tiny bit of housekeeping to deal with before we talk about the Amplitude envelope. I want to point you at the course tuner in the comments section at the top here. Can you see that it's currently set to +12? Well, it was before I clicked on it. That's because of this mismatch between the DAW and the Roland product. Cubase says it's a C3, Roland says it's a C4, they disagree. And so in the last episode, you saw me send the notes through a transformer to basically drop the octave to get Cubase and Zenology talking the same language. The problem with that is that the note that gets output to the instrument is actually an octave low. So if I press a C3 on the keyboard, all of the instruments will register it as a C3, but you'll hear a C2. And so in order to correct that, I've just increased the course tuning by 12. So now everything is absolutely aligned. If I press any key on the keyboard, you're seeing a C3 in the tuner, which corresponds, I'll just press play on the sequence that I've put in below. You can see C3 is going to get output, same note, and that's interpreted by Roland as a C3 as well. I can prove that by pulling the range control down to B2. We won't hear that note. There we go. And then bring it up to C3, and we will hear the note. So everything is now talking a consistent language. Now it is a little bit annoying that I've had to jump through all of those hoops, but now everything that we see is completely consistent. And so what I've done is I've saved a basic preset. You can see I've called it basic tone with all of those settings baked in. I've chosen a preset 21, which is a soft EP. It's just a nice gentle sound that's not going to be too offensive as a basic tone when we're deconstructing the synth. One final thing I've also done, and we're going to be having a look at this today, is in the Amplitude envelope itself, I've set the velocity sensitivity to 0, just for the time being. So no matter what key I press on the keyboard, I can press them hard, I can press them soft. We're just hearing the same volume all the time, so it's totally consistent. Right, that's the housekeeping out of the way. That's our basic tone set up. And so now we can start having a look at what this Amplitude envelope does. It's an ADDSR envelope, and that stands for attack, 2 stages of decay, sustain and release. And each one of these little squares corresponds to one of those stages. You can also see that as I hover over each of the squares, we get a little pop-up box. It's not the prettiest. I mean, this isn't a pretty interface, but it is functional. And it shows us that we've got T3, L3. T stands for time, L stands for level. So if I start moving these things around, what we're going to get now is a note that takes longer to get to maximum volume and then comes back off maximum volume and holds at this plateau level. Let's hear what that sounds like. It's getting louder and louder, and you can see it in the oscilloscope. There's maximum level. Now it's coming down, and eventually it will plateau at a lower than maximum level and stick there. And it'll stick at that volume until I let the key go, when there's an almost instant release. This line here, right at the end, is the release curve, and it's almost instant. As I kind of move my mouse around these various nodes, you can see crosshairs. Sometimes it's a vertical and horizontal crosshair, telling you that you've got level and time control over the node. So I can pick that node up and move it both left and right and up and down. But sometimes the crosshairs are only in one direction. So this node here, which is the sustain node, can only be adjusted vertically. It can't be moved horizontally. That's because it represents that point where you've pressed the key, you've held it down, and now for as long as you hold it down, you're going to get this level. The concept of time has no meaning for the sustain point. Similarly, for the release node down here, we've only got a time value because the release node will always end up at 0 level. I can only drag it left and right. Now, do you see those numbers in the little pop-up box saying T2 673 and L2 1003? That's an arbitrary number, anywhere from 0 to 1023. 1024 is a magic number in computing terms because it's 2 to the power of 10. It's basically 2 multiplied by 2 10 times. So 0 to 1023 is just a very common number to be used. These are arbitrary values, and in terms of time, the maximum value that you can have, 1023, corresponds with 30 seconds of time. So if I set the attack phase at its maximum, 1023, and press a key on the keyboard, I'm not going to ask you to sit there and wait for 30 seconds, but I have timed it. And I just basically worked that out empirically. It doesn't say anywhere in the manual that's what 1023 corresponds to. But the maximum amount of attack time you can have on a note on this synthesizer is 30 seconds. That's also true for all of the other stages. So if I set everything at 1023, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 time-based stages, and we've got a maximum of 2 minutes that this envelope can evolve for. Obviously, that's not usable in normal circumstances. But the reason I mention it so early on in this tutorial series is that it's just something to get used to. The vast majority of numbers that you see in this synth are going to be arbitrary ranges. It might be 0 to 100, it might be 0 to 1023. Try not to worry too much about what the value itself means, because they're scaled internally inside the synthesizer to just give you nothing, small, getting bigger, big, as big as possible. And whatever those values are, it's going to be very context sensitive. So what we're looking at now is a pretty classical ADSR envelope, because I've got these 2 decay stages basically drawing a straight line. That's the kind of thing that you'll see in many an audio book talking about envelopes. You press the key, there's that attack phase where it gets louder, and then it comes back off the maximum volume and then sticks at that constant level. You can actually trim away some of the complexity of that envelope. You can turn it into an absolutely classical ADSR envelope that any analog synthesizer would possess. If we nip over to the Pro Edit section, now the majority of what we're going to be talking about today are going to be in the amp sections, but this one feature is actually in common. And I'm going to scroll down until I get to this setting here. It says partial 1, because we're dealing with partial 1, ADSR switch. If I turn that on, partial 1 is now emulating the amplitude envelope of a classical analog synthesizer. And now you see that one of the nodes has disappeared. This is a much simpler envelope to handle. Furthermore, lots of the nodes are actually fixed. For instance, the attack can't ever be taken off maximum. In other words, every time you press a key, it's going to get to maximum volume every time. The simplicity of the envelope is also represented in the crosshairs. The attack node only has a vertical, there's your crosshair, and then we've just got a horizontal for the sustain. Release always goes down to 0. So if you want to just deal in really simple envelopes and you don't want that additional complexity, turn that partial switch on. We're going to be jumping between Visual and Pro Edit a lot in this tutorial series. I want you to become comfortable with using both pages simultaneously, and you very often toggling backwards and forwards very quickly between them. Okay, what else have we got in the main screen? An overall level. So this is your master level control for this individual partial. We've got 4 partials in the synth in total, so this is how you can mix them together easily. And we've also got pan, which is pretty straightforward. If you're listening in stereo, you'll have heard that just sweep through the range. Now, can you see that's currently set to -38? I want to get it back to 0. I want it back in the middle. Doing it manually is tricky. You actually have to kind of quite carefully get to 0. Whereas if I press the control key on the keyboard and click in the control, it resets to its default value. Nice, easy shortcut. This is our velocity sensitivity, and we talked about this at the beginning of the tutorial. If I set that to maximum and press a key softly, I'm having to hit it quite hard to get any volume at all. And then if I really smack it, it's actually difficult to make it get to the maximum volume. A little bit more of a reasonable velocity sensitivity. Let's just give my bring my attack down so that we can really hear this. There we go. So if you want something that has velocity sensitivity in the region of 20 to 30 to 40 is going to give you a really usable, good effect. But for the purposes of today, let's compress the control key because I've just been talking about it. I've just set it to 0. Underneath we've got 2 LFOs. I'm trying to avoid talking too much about the LFOs yet because it's a huge subject in its own right. But basically imagine it, you've got a couple of waves that you can dynamically assign to all sorts of different controls. The easiest thing for me to do is just turn it on and give you a quick demo of what's going on. So here's LFO1. If I turn that all the way up to maximum, I'm just going to press a key and hold it down. Now you can hear that volume going up and down. The volume's changing according to this wave. So LFO1 is currently set to a sine wave. And this is its rate. This is how fast it's cycling. Can you see it again? 1023. So we're not dealing in milliseconds here. We're dealing in a range from fastest to slowest. It's a little bit unusual. Lots of synthesizers have specific millisecond values that you can set. That's generally not how this synth works. I'm just going to avoid any more discussion of the LFO today and turn it back off again. Control click, disable that. And now let's hop over to have a look at our built-in EQ. So we need to turn the EQ on in order to be able to use it. And now we get a 3-stage EQ. There's my low node, mid, and high. And I basically get a pretty basic but usable EQ graph. The middle node, you can control the shallowness or acuteness of that bump with the mid Q. You can see pretty obviously what that's doing. So if I set a really steep Q and then start dragging this node around, it's a really easy way to very quickly dial in the sound that you might be looking for. Turn the EQ off and all of those values are suspended again, and we're back to our default sound. So a really nice set of basic functionality that we get from the visual editor. Now let's jump over to Pro Edit and see what's going on under the hood, because there's a lot more values here, a lot more settings that we've got access to that you can't get to from the visual editor. So I'm going to click Amp, which just auto scrolls us to the Amp section. And here you can see some of the controls are there. Here's the level. If I turn the level down to 58, hop back over to Visual Edit, there's my level at 58, drag it up to 74, values changed again. There we go, 74. Velocity curve is quite an esoteric one. Can you see that the value is 1? For the vast majority of time, that's absolutely fine. It basically specifies a gradient or a curve over which the keyboard is going to respond to different velocity sensitivities. Now, I've currently got velocity sensitivity turned off, but if I just show you the manual very quickly, here are the 7 different shapes of curve. So 1 is the perfectly normal one. In other words, the softest I can possibly hit the key is going to be down at the bottom of the graph and generate a low volume. And if I hit the key as hard as I possibly can, it's going to be at the maximum end of the graph. But you can see that you can set different sensitivities, inverse logarithms, and all sorts of crazy stuff. Guitarists will be pretty familiar with this concept because the volume knob on a guitar is typically logarithmic. In other words, it's not equal. It doesn't generate an equal increase in volume over the course of the range. It actually has this logarithmic shape. That's how the human ear works. Bias level lets you override the default behavior for the span of the keyboard. So if I set bias level to maximum, now I'm just going to play all of the notes on the keyboard from low to high. You heard it get basically progressively louder as I went up the keyboard. That's what the bias does. It has like a seesaw point. You specify what note your seesaw is going to be set to. The default value for this one is a little bit weird. Can you see bias position is 60? That's actually the default. Control click sets to 60, but 64 is actually middle C. I don't know what they're playing at there. It's a little bit crazy. So the default bias position at 60 is 1, 2, 3, 4, A flat 3, It's like, okay, fair enough. But basically that's the center point around which the increase or decrease of volume will be based. You can even specify whether or not only notes above or below the center point get modulated. That's just getting a little bit carried away in my opinion. Then we've got pan settings. There's all the way to the left. Just set my bias level back to 0, otherwise everything's very quiet. There's on the left. There's on the right. Control click, set pan back to 0. Pan key follow, let's set that to maximum. I'm going to sweep up my keyboard again. You heard it pan from the left ear to the right ear. And random pan depth is a nice one. First thing that I'll do is get carried away and set it to maximum, and now just press C on the keyboard. You can hear it randomly choose different pan positions. Well, that's a bit disorienting, and I'm not a big fan of that value. But if I have it down in the 15 to 20 range, now I've got a nice subtle variance between each time I press a key, I'm getting a slightly different pan position. So that's quite nice. The alternating pan depth, I'll just turn this one off, does a much more violent thing. It basically says every time you press a key, go to the other ear. So it's much more fixed, which I'm less a fan of because it doesn't have that kind of organic sense. But if that's what you want, like Welcome to the Machine sort of thing, where the sounds are just bouncing from one ear to the other. If you wanted to emulate that kind of effect, you do it with the alt pan depth. Vibrato level sensitivity, you'll find as we go through these various different sections, there are lots of different ways that you can plug vibrato into individual components of the synth. So we have a master vibrato setting here. If I just turn that up, vibrato is pitch modulation. You can see that in the oscilloscope. I'm nodding towards the oscilloscope as if you can see me, but obviously that's increasing and decreasing the pitch. As the waves are squashing and expanding, that's what you're seeing. But if I change the vibrato level sensitivity for the amplitude envelope, don't forget we're talking about volume. Amplitude is all about volume. So now if I increase this, it's in addition to increasing and decreasing the pitch, it's also going to increase and decrease the volume. Turn that off. And turn this off. So I'm control clicking each time I click each of these controls just to reset them back to default. Stereo width doesn't mean anything if we've only got one sound, but if I throw a sound into the second channel of this partial, we've now got the electric piano being mixed with a Celesta. Okay. Now with stereo width set to 100, if I pan that hard right, we're just going to hear the Celesta, and hard left, just the electric piano. Stereo width at 0, you're going to hear both sounds mixed together, but still just in the left ear. Set that back to central. Since we're dealing with the amplitude envelope today, we'll have a look at the amp env section as well. So I can just click on that to scroll it up to the top of the screen. The two velocity sensitivity controls here, T1 and T4. T1 is the attack, T4 is the release. This basically determines whether or not how hard you hit the keyboard has an effect on the amplitude envelope's shape. I've just set my envelope switch back to off again, so to give me the complex envelope shape. And I've set my time to 420, which allows me to play a really soft note. You can see the volume going up fairly slowly. If I hit that note hard, you hit the attack almost instantly. Get back down to the amp env section, turn that off. I'm not going to demonstrate T4 because basically I don't know how to. This is release velocity. I don't even think this keyboard generates release velocity. That's how loud the key is released. I don't even know how to trigger that. I've never used release velocity. If you want to look into that, that's be my guest. LFO trigger, if you turn this on, The LFO, that cycling thing we saw earlier, is actually going to trigger the envelope over and over again. So what I'm going to do is bring my attack in so it's nice and sharp. Turn this on. I'm just going to hold the key down on the keyboard. And now you can hear that's the LFO cycling. We've got this sine wave going on in the background. And every time it completes a cycle, it's re-triggering the envelope. These values down here correspond to the curve. So T1 attack is currently 0 because I set it to vertical. But if I increase T1 attack time, then you can see the value's gone up. So this is one of these situations where visual is so much better than trying to do this stuff mathematically, but you can actually set the numbers and then go in and see what that envelope now looks like. Obviously, this is the way I would prefer to process an envelope if I was drawing one. Finally, time key follow maps your keyboard to squash or expand the envelope. So if I set the time key follow to maximum, the length of the decay period of the curve, in other words T2 to T4, is going to be altered over the course of the keyboard. So if I set this to maximum and press a very low note, it's going to have a massive release phase, while the entire envelope is just going to stretch out and you can hear it going on in the background. Now I'll press a very high note and it will disappear very quickly. So this is just a good way of emulating that real world effect. If you hit a very high guitar note, it'll fade away very quickly. Hit the bass note, it'll ring out for much longer. That's the Amplitude envelope covered. That's really hard to say, Amplitude envelope. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.